Welcome to The Day After, Key Election Questions and Where We Are Now, hosted by the Princeton University Office of Communications. I am Ben Chang, the Deputy Vice President for Communications here at Princeton. If you are all like me, you might be a wee bit bleary-eyed after staying up late last night. So, we will get right down to it and turn to the folks you really came to hear from in just a quick moment. First, a thank you to the entire Office of Communications team for their quick work in standing this event up and all their work this year. I really appreciate it. Our goals for the next few minutes are to cut through the noise and help each of us face today's uncertainty with clear-eyed questions, the key questions to consider, both for the presidency and for our society moving forward. The speakers will talk about what questions aren't being asked and what issues aren't being raised so that we can help focus on the days to come. Now, over to my charismatic communications colleague and co-conspirator, Jamie Saxon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jamie Saxon from Princeton University's Office of Communications. During weeks of early voting and yesterday on Election Day, we cast our ballots in arguably one of the most consequential elections in our lifetime. We've gathered some of Princeton's most perceptive, incisive voices to help us define the questions we should be asking in this moment. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Michael Calderone, Senior Editor at Vanity Fair's The Hive and 2018 Ferris Professor of Journalism at Princeton. Brandice Canes-Wrone, the Donald E. Stokes Professor of Public and International Affairs and Professor of Politics and Public Affairs. Eddie Glaude Jr., the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor and Professor of African American Studies. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, Assistant Professor of African American Studies. Ali Valenzuela, Assistant Professor of Politics, and Keith Whittington, the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics. I'll turn it over to you, Ben, to kick off the conversation.
Thanks very much, Jamie. So we're going to start off with one question for each of our panelists in a round-robin style. And we're going to start with Keeanga. So Keeanga, a two-part question. One, did you get any sleep last night? And two, what is the one question we should be asking ourselves today as we weigh both what happened on Election Day and the uncertainty of what comes next? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I went to sleep around 2 a.m. and then got up again at 5. And, you know, it's been a crazy day. There are a few things that stand out to me. So I think I have a couple of questions. I think the strangest part of this is that it appears, at least as the votes come in, that Trump is losing, but not in ways that we expected. And so I think that many people who were hoping for a Biden victory, in fact, feel as if Biden has lost. And, you know, this is still very much up in the air, but I think that relates to a bigger issue. I think the two things that stand out to me, one is the kind of questions, the existential questions that are raised about American democracy through the course of this electoral process, the relentless obstacles to voting. This has typically been centered on Black voters in elections previous, but I think there's a much more generalized attack, obstacles to the simple act of voting. So that's one thing. The other is, what is this appeal of Trump? I think that it's clear that the Trump campaign made a decision to run on racism very early. That attracted a majority of voters. But at the same time, if these exit polls have any veracity to them, it appears that he has been able to pull off some Latino voters and some Black voters. And so what are the appeals beyond white supremacy that the Trump administration, the Trump campaign holds? And then the last thing has to do with the Democratic Party. I think even as Biden is poised to win the Electoral College, the Democrats expect it to win in a very different way. the whole discussion about should we pack the Supreme Court or not hinged on the Democrats taking the Senate, obviously holding the House. Not only is it's pretty clear that they're not going to take the Senate, but they lost seats in the House. And so that raises a question about what is happening with the Democratic Party's political strategy that is not only causing them to lose core constituencies, demographics, to the Republicans, but also seems to have brought forth a message that was not as powerful as I think they thought it was.
Thanks very much for that. And I think there's at least a few themes you've touched on that we'll continue to discuss with our larger group. So let me turn to Keith. Same question, sir. Did you get any sleep last night? And what is the one question that you have on your mind, or that we should be asking ourselves today?
I certainly went to bed much later than I was hoping for last night. I think there are sort of two large issues that I'm particularly thinking about at the moment. I mean, one, I think we just heard, there was some expectation that this election might break the logjam and really change the dynamics of American politics in a very basic way, perhaps putting the Democratic Party in a very solid majority position. We haven't seen that. Instead, we see sort of a continuation of the very polarized, very divided electorate that we've had for quite some time now. But under the surface of that, there's clearly some shifting going on. The Trump administration, the Trump Republican Party is a little different than the older Republican Party. It's remaking its own coalition. I think it remains to be seen where that goes in the future. The Democrats clearly are going to have some things to talk about among themselves as well as to where they're going to go in the future. And so in the midst of all this continuation of the same, under the surface, I think there's going to be a lot of change about what the parties look like, and a lot of uncertainty as to what that looks like. The more immediate thing I'm also wondering is how aggressive the Republicans will be in trying to ultimately win this for Trump. There's still a lot of votes to be counted, still likely some litigation that's going to be taking place, some recounting that's likely to occur. The Trump White House has indicated that they, of course, want to be very aggressive in fighting this. A lot of Republican leaders have really signaled that they do not want to be so aggressive in fighting this. And we'll approach this process in a much more normal and calm way. So I think one thing to be looking for over the next week or two is just how aggressive does the fighting become in trying to work out these counts on the last few ballots.
Watch this space to be sure. Okay, Eddie Glaude Jr., sir, same question. Did you get any sleep last night? And what is the one question on your mind that we should be asking ourselves today?
Well, no, I didn't get any sleep last night, so but it is what it is. My basic question is, why is this so close? Why was this so close? And we have 4 years of evidence. The 4 years of evidence of incompetence, 230,000 Americans dead, of mendacity, lying every day, of corruption, and yet the coalition that Keith just laid out voted for him anyway. So it seems to me that we got to ask ourselves the more fundamental question is, how in the hell could this be this close, given the evidence of 4 years of horrendous governance of the country?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Letting it sink in just for a second there. Apologies to our broader audience. Michael Calderone, same question for you, sir. Welcome back to the Princeton fold. Good to see you again. Sleep, main question.
Sleep started. I was running a Vanity Fair's live blog until about 3:30 in the morning. So we went to bed shortly after that. I got a little bit of a nap today, though. But just the question that I have is whether the public, and especially 60 million plus Americans who voted for Donald Trump, are going to have trust in the integrity of this election, especially when you have the President of the United States on a daily basis or many times a day misinforming the public about bogus claims of voter fraud. You know, I think back a lot to a couple weeks after the 2016 election in November of 2016. Donald Trump started tweeting that millions of undocumented people had voted illegally in the 2016 election. Now, that was a complete lie. There's absolutely no evidence for that to be true. But if Donald Trump was willing to lie to the public in an election he won, I always thought, what would he do in an election he lost or was in the process of possibly losing? And we've been seeing this for the last several months, where he's been laying the groundwork by talking about a rigged process, that mail-in votes are not to be trusted. And this is something he's been misinforming the public constantly over the last several months. And he's doing so now. When you see companies like Twitter, blocking some of his tweets and things like that, but he still has a massive audience, and there's a large right-wing echo chamber on Facebook and elsewhere that is already today knocking around, sharing bogus claims about fraud. And so I wonder that as this vote is going on, how do a huge swath of America believe what they're being told as far as the final results?
They can cut both ways, right? We'll revisit social media for sure, sir, in a little bit. Ali, same question for you, sir. Any sleep and key question on your mind? You're on mute.
Yeah, I got some sleep, but not nearly enough in light of like the last week of relatively little sleep. But here's my question. My question for me, a question for all of you out there, which is, what are you going to do next? Right? So a wholesale repudiation of Donald Trump is not going to materialize. We are living in a settler colonizing nation that was founded on genocide and slavery. Our institutions have been constructed on this foundation, and they reflect their racist origins and reify them in law and public policy. Trump's only the latest Republican leader to embrace this racism and to gain supporters using these kinds of racist appeals and racist messages. For millions of white Americans, this is a feature and not a bug. For the rest of his supporters, it was at least tolerable, so long as their white prerogatives are protected. Sure, others gave Trump support too, but my question stands, right? What are you going to do next in response to this? Since 1992, Republicans have won the popular vote for president exactly once, right? The Electoral College has to go. It was established to enshrine the 3/5 rule and give disproportionate power to Southern slave states for subjugating human beings. It was challenged in the 1960s as an affront to civil rights, and yet reform of this institution, of this racist institution, was blocked by Southern segregationist senators. So the Electoral College has to go. But whether Biden wins, whether Trump wins, what are you going to do next to combat racism? What are you going to do next to make sure that democracy in this country survives, that science is listened to, that experts are valued, that teachers are paid enough, right? The activism, the energy that we saw leading up to this day can't stop now. So that's my one question going forward. What are we all going to do next?
Thank you, Ali. And again, I think a couple themes at least that we're going to revisit in just a second. Brandice, if we could bring you on and ask you the same. I think there was a big warm up there. Sleep and main question for you. From where you
I did not sleep, and I feel particularly silly because I texted and wrote lots of friends and colleagues. It's going to be really tight. We don't know the results, but then you're there and you just can't stop. You just can't stop watching, thinking maybe I'll be wrong. So for me, one of the big questions, and I think for a lot of political scientists, is what are we supposed to make of the polls? I'm seeing these jokes going around. There's a poll that everybody thinks we should never trust the polls again, right? So what's happening? And the sort of immediate conventional wisdom is that there's all these shy Trump voters. Biden was predicted at the national level, which were usually much better. And I'm not an election polling person, but I work in the area of opinion polling, and we're pretty good at national polls. So, saying Biden's going to win by 8 or 10, and then yes, it can move from 2, but it's not moving from 2 to 10. It's just not happening. So what's going on? And is it realistic that these are all shy Trump voters? I think that's, in a weird way, very appealing it's been said by some of the conservative outlets. Everybody's just afraid to admit they're voting for Trump. And certainly in some parts of America, that's true, but that's not true in rural Pennsylvania. That's not true in areas where Trump is bringing in lots of votes. So that doesn't really hold a lot of water to me, in the sense that Fox News was predicting Biden would win big. Are people afraid to tell Fox News that this is true? That doesn't make a lot of sense, that they support Trump. So I think that what we're going to need to look at carefully, at this point, things are still coming in. I certainly wouldn't want to claim to know the answers, but there were these predictions of historic turnout that was going to be the largest since 1908. That always struck me as a little optimistic. Obviously, we don't know, and we want to hope that those, turnout is good. So we want to hope that that's true. But in the middle of a pandemic, how realistic is that? And there's evidence in political science that mail voting, contrary to what all reformers and frankly everyone would hope, certainly in political science, that it has not increased turnout a lot in other elections. Obviously here, it must have increased turnout from what it would otherwise be in a pandemic. So that's not claiming it's, wasn't a good thing, or that it's not even a good thing in general. But it has not produced the large turnout increases in Oregon, for instance, which has had, mail-in voting for some time, and in the California areas that have had it. To predict that we would somehow have 8 percentage points higher turnout than 2008 always struck me as
let's get to
optimistic. Yeah,
I absolutely want to unpack turnout and also voter protection and suppression. So we'll follow up on that. Eddie, I know you got to bounce in a second.
Yeah.
I'm going to revisit something you touched on and many others did. I'm going to say that for the special audience that we have today, I wanted to plumb your and the panelists' deepest held beliefs and private thoughts. So I went to your Twitter feeds and TV appearances. And this morning on Morning Joe, you talked about how race continues to confound this democracy. You mind unpacking that a little bit for us?
Right. I mean, I might choose a different verb tonight. It's haunt, compromise this democracy in so many ways, right? So look, for much of this election cycle, we've been talking about Trump governing only to his base, and that the way in which he governs, alienating not only Bush Republicans, but also suburban women, white women in particular. And that given that, basic blocking and tackling of politics involves addition, right? How is he going to expand his coalition? Because he was just governing to his base. And I understood very clearly that what Donald Trump was trying to do, he's just looking at the raw numbers. If you look at all of the Americans who don't vote, there are more white people who don't vote than people of color. And if he could, in fact, get them to turn out, then he could, in fact, expand his base and bank on the fact that Republicans would not, in effect, stay home or vote for the Democrat. And so part of what I'm interested in seeing how white women, whether or not they did what they said they were going to do. I'm interested in seeing whether or not Republicans stayed home. And I see, when we look at the rural turnout, did he, in fact, appeal to those disaffected white voters, those new voters, those first-time voters, not first-time, but those new voters, those voters who did not vote in the 2016 election, because I know what was the basis of that appeal. The appeal to those disaffected voters was white grievance, hatred, and white resentment. And that, to me, points to the fact that race still animates the body politic in this country, and that Trump is an avatar of that very fact. I apologize, I have to leave really quickly, but I have to go talk. I know I just said a lot of controversial stuff, but I got to go talk with the president of Pomona College about this very thing. I apologize.
Eddie, thank you for your time. We will continue this conversation and we'll fill you in afterwards. Thank you very much.
Take care now.
Okay, Eddie. And speaking of continuing that, if you would indulge me, Keith, you had talked about the divided electorate, breaking log jams. Can I ask you just to build a little bit or riff off of what Eddie just talked about? We're used to in our cable news consumption here about the rural-urban divides, coastal, middle of the country, so on and so forth. Could you expand on that? And what questions should we be asking around that, around this sort of notion of a divided electorate? And where are those fissures? How do we talk about them smartly?
Well, clearly the electorate has been very divided for quite some time, just extraordinary negative polarization and just hostility to members of the other party, which attracts people to their own brand and wanting to vote for it. Trump has been very good at exploiting that, but he's hardly alone in exploiting that. But part of the complication, I think, of emerging out of this electorate is what exactly the shape of the two parties is going to look like going forward. Trump made a real play to try to beef up the idea that the Republican Party is going to be a working class party to a greater degree, that's going to expand the number of Republican voters who don't have college degrees, for example. That requires really reshaping that party, and it's hard to know exactly what kind of politicians are going to emerge out of that, what kind of policies are ultimately going to emerge out of that. It's a pretty different looking Republican Party than what's existed in the past. He's been more successful at that than I would have expected. I think than lots of other politicians expected him to be. It was a huge gamble to imagine that you could turn out those kind of disaffected voters this time around and not try to build on the base in a more traditional way. And it remains to be seen what the Republican Party does with that moving forward. And that's going to have implications for then how the Democrats try to construct their coalition as well.
Keeanga, can I turn back to you? Yep. There's a thread here. You had talked about losing core constituencies. And there's some reflections, I think, going on in the other comments. I'll sort of hand the mic to you for a second on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I was reacting to earlier today is the just using race and white supremacy as the only lens through which we comprehend what Trump has done. I think in a lot of ways we have to look at the way in which Trump is also an expression of anti-politics. One of the things that I think is Naomi Klein wrote in her book "No Is Not Enough" about Donald Trump in 2016 had an important observation about the Trump brand. That in many ways makes him impervious to the consequences that other elected officials are really hemmed in by, which is this kind of nihilism, narcissism, rejection of the tropes and gestures of mainstream politics. And I think in that way, when, to me, the best example of that is when Trump talks about COVID. All of us are in shock and disgust about the way that he discusses this. But when Biden brings it up in the debate or makes it a key part of his campaign, Trump very clearly in the second debate doesn't run away from this. He doubles down on this idea that it'll just disappear. It's just this thing that is being used against me as a political trick. And it creates the impression that he is the kind of anti-establishment politician. Even as the president, he is anti-establishment in ways that Joe Biden is the consummate politician, the consummate foil to Donald Trump. So even in the second debate, when everyone cringes when Trump does the mocking Joe Biden for talking about sitting around the kitchen table, that thing he does, this conventional political affect, it makes most people cringe. But I think people who want to grouse about mainstream politicians, who want to grouse about these canned speeches of elected officials, embrace this. And so Trump doesn't really stand for anything except a rejection of the establishment, a rejection of the normal kind of status quo, even as he simultaneously upholds it. So for me, this was just about thinking about some of the other aspects of his appeal that would make him inviting to a portion, a tiny but significant, unprecedented proportion of Black voters, a significant proportion of Latino voters as well. I just think that we have to complicate our understanding of the appeal of his politics beyond just racism and white supremacy, which is obviously a core of it, but I don't think can explain the entire thing.
Between what Eddie, Keith, Keeanga, what you've talked about, I feel like we go in a couple different directions, and so I sort of toss this to Brandice. Maybe we can go back to you. So if you are a pollster, and Michael, don't lean back too much because I'm going to talk about what if you're a journalist in a second. Given the rejection of the established tropes of politics, Keeanga, if I got you right there, Keith, given the redefinition of parties that's going on, Brandice, as the political scientist, then how do you analyze this landscape? Or are we just asking all the wrong questions as we look at this pivot point in American politics?
So I definitely think we're asking the right questions, but I'll add one additional, which links to the polls, but goes into this issue of kind of, where are the parties headed and what's Trump's appeal, but what's also not his appeal. So the Republican Party is to the extent that you look at the House and the Senate and even the state legislatures, seems to be so far, and these smaller, particularly state legislative races can hinge on a very small number of votes, but seems to be outperforming Trump. And that's both the Biden's not carrying a lot of coattails, as we often think of presidential elections, but so Collins, has won Maine. Everyone thought that wouldn't happen, right? That was, certainly a leans Democrat going in. So Collins wins. It's a complicated voting system in Maine. We won't go into that, but wins by several percentage points, even with their ranked choice voting. Trump loses statewide by 10 percentage points. That's a huge gap. In the Peters-James race in Michigan, now things switch, or they could have switched since it started, but so far, right, looks like we may have a Republican senator in Michigan. It's at least possible, certainly outperforming Trump. In Texas, Cornyn's outperforming Trump's percentages. So this presents sort of an interesting situation, and again, we could go on with House and state legislative races, but that for all of this sort of, is Trump bringing people in? I guess he is, but there are a lot of people who are not voting for Trump, who are voting for more traditional Republicans, and I think that leads to a real question about where the party will go. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily, want to scrap reaching out to less educated and less well-off voters. So I think that kind of from a policy side, it presents, a very interesting, you could say, opportunity and challenge for both parties in terms of what happens once the sort of complete sort of reality star aspect of this all is removed.
Thank you for that. Ali, you asked, what can we do next? We have an audience right now of, among other students, of community members from Princeton and elsewhere that are considering in this landscape, what is the next step I take? What do I either study? What do I want to become professional in? Where do I go next? You sounded that note. Given the points that folks have made about just coming to grips with what the evolution, the change that we see across the country, what is your recommendation on how we get our heads around this, and what would be viable next steps? Again, regardless of who becomes president, to better understand what's going on.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as a way to respond to that, I wanted to also key in on Keeanga-Yamahtta's point about sort of needing to think beyond race to some of these other issues that might be mobilizing other people. And I just can't help but think that all of those other issues, they continue to intersect with the central cleavage in American politics, which remains race, right? So anti-establishmentism, for example, if we think that there was some tenuous norm of egalitarianism, right, that there was some agreement between leaders of the two parties, that we don't treat others in a certain way in public, right, that we took seriously, right, this norm that all are created equal and should be treated equal in politics and policy, right, then his behavior becomes more explicable, right? So his response to the pandemic and his seeming lack of care and concern for it, right? Black and brown people are dying disproportionately because of this disease, right? Older people, poor people are dying disproportionately, right? The people that I would suggest someone like him thinks are expendable, right? So yes, I do think that there are other issues, and we should explore them. We should be, thinking about why broad swaths of the American public are willing to, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, believe whatever comes out of his mouth, right? Like that's a deep problem, and why it is that we find it acceptable, right? That an institution like Fox News can just serve as the mouthpiece of the U.S. president, right? So these are all like deeply concerning issues, but ultimately I think they come back to the issue of race. And so what can we do, to your question, Ben? The problem is that all of this energy post-election day almost always just stops, right? But politicians, they respond to people that are reaching out to them, that are contacting them, that are showing them that there's going to be consequences for how they represent their interests, how they represent their constituents, right? So all of you folks who sent letters, all of you folks who sent text messages, right? You can continue those campaigns, but now target your representatives, right? Inundate them with these kinds of messages, with this kind of contact, and press them to actually listen to the people and what you all, what interests we have that need to be addressed. Contacting representatives makes a difference. Donating makes a difference, right? Trying to amplify your voice by working with other organizations that are doing this, that are registering new people to vote, right? All of these efforts can continue to happen even after the election.
Can I just say, Ben, really quick, because I think Ali makes a really important point, and I think that race is the absolute pivot of Trump's campaign. My only thing is that I think we have to say more to understand how Trump makes these significant inroads among Black male voters. If we are to believe the exit polls, which shows a 5% increase from 2016, how does he make inroads among Black women voters? If we are to believe the exit polls, which show a +4 increase among Latino men voters, 33%, among Latinas, 23%. And so I think that if we only focus on race as the only explanation, it doesn't give us enough particularity to make sense of that, even if we come back to a framework where white supremacy and racism is at the heart of the campaign. What within that is making these particular appeals to these of color voters?
So can I just say, sure, if we're going to ask those questions, though, we have to be asking those questions about white men, about white women, right? To ask these questions only of Latino and African American men and women, I think is a disservice. To our conversation, to our discourse, and it just doesn't actually get at the root of the problem, right? If Biden had pulled out just a few more, a few percentage points more among whites, we wouldn't be talking about this, right? We all would have gotten a lot of sleep last night.
Keith, I saw you nodding.
Well, I mean, obviously these kind of cleavages are massively important. What's striking about some of the exit polls is they do suggest that Trump was drawing in minority voters in ways that I don't think anyone was really expecting, except maybe the Trump White House itself. They were clearly making a play for it. The other thing that comes out of the exit polls, though, that may interact with this, I'm really struck by, is the extent to which this election was largely about the pandemic. Issues of 2016, for example, about immigration were way in the background among what voters thought was most important going into this. Some of those voters who cared a lot about the pandemic voted for Biden ultimately, but a tremendous number voted for Trump, and they voted for Trump in part, I'm worried, out of an anti-lockdown policy set of concerns, which is going to have real implications for how we think about public policy moving forward. There are a lot of blue collar voters, in particular, very hurt by the lockdown policies. A lot of those were attributable to Democratic governors, not to Trump. And so how voters are assessing who's to blame for what they were feeling about the pandemic seems potentially complicated. And it's going to be complicated in ways that are going to make solving this problem in the coming months and weeks very complicated as well.
Brandice, we're talking polls, and I know that's not your sole thing. You're itching to come in on that. Do you mind for 30 seconds come in on that?
Yeah, no, I think that, it's a very interesting question for both parties. A lot of Republican politicians have not made efforts in a significant way, particularly with the Black community. And you could say, well, it's really stunning. I mean, here's Trump. He has this rhetoric that's, I won't put it on others, making me cringe and, makes a lot of people cringe. And he's saying and doing things. And then here he is. He's making a big play. And I think that, that part of it, of really going in and trying to think about policies that would appeal to a more diverse set of Republican voters is a good thing. And the Democrats will respond, that this is going to be a dynamic situation. And some of those policies are economic policies, as Keith mentioned, the pandemic, this issue, it's just really, it's very complicated. It is absolutely true what Ali said, obviously, about who's disproportionately affected, but it's disproportionately affected in multiple ways. Economically, a lot of the burden, right, is being borne by individuals who, can't work from home online, right, or they lose their job, or their small business is closing. And that's going to have very complicated repercussions for how, various communities will be voting and how they'll feel about Trump's handling of the pandemic.
Michael, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that, and perhaps this is a better question for the Democrats. So the issue I ended on in my opening comments was, what is happening with the Democratic Party's strategy, where they expected to win big and significantly, so much so that everyone was talking about what they were going to do with, the entire Congress locked up behind the president. And that has been completely turned on its head. And they made a calculated strategy early on to go with centrism, to go with Biden, that this was the safe and steady, cautious way to defeat Trump. And instead, the Democrats are possibly on the verge of winning this. And there is massive confusion and disappointment with where the party is at right now.
Thank you for that. Michael, let me pivot slightly, though very much related to this conversation thread. I saw on the Twitters an equation, a very simple equation put up. Local journalism greater than polling. What is this from? And I don't mean to be pretty basic here, but as our Ferris professor, as our the eye on journalism and its role in a vibrant democracy, what is your view on what questions journalists should have coming out of this campaign season and on the issues that we just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. We have a crisis in local journalism happening right now around the country. The Trump era has been very good for certain news organizations in terms of their bottom line. The New York Times subscriptions are up. Other magazines you see, like the New Yorker and Atlantic, are doing well in terms of subscriptions. Cable ratings have been up, but local journalism, local newspapers especially, have been hit. We're already hit hard by disruption in the industry, and then have been shell-shocked by the pandemic. And so, there is a question about what information the public is getting. Are they reading just what's on Facebook, or are they getting relevant, legitimate, responsible local news about what's happening in their communities? And in this election, you see. You see these kind of fake news sites, actual fake news, not what Trump calls fake news, but news sites propping up that are meant to look like local news organizations, but are actually funded by, right-wing sources and things like that are, putting out a perspective under the guise of local news. You have a media company like Sinclair, which owns local outlets around the country and runs and puts on air what look like regular 30-minute local news shows with sports and weather and all that, but also inject a kind of right-wing point of view in there. And, as I was saying before, I think in terms of kind of the crisis about whether the public, especially the Trump supporting public, will see this election as a quote unquote fraud, as he would like to use. I think it is concerning. Every day, if you look at Facebook, almost exclusively the top 10 most engaged pieces on Facebook are from right-wing sources. They're not from traditional news outlets in any sort of way. So, I mean, I do think the news outlets that are successful right now really do need to make inroads as much as possible in partnering with local news outlets and making sure the best that they can to get that information out to people around the country. Now, whether people will rather just believe whatever meme comes up in their Facebook feed versus the local newspaper or local news site, I can't tell them what to believe or not, but it's important to have those sources readily available.
Thank you, Michael. At this point, I'm going to abuse my moderator microphone and give a shout out to Joe Stevens, who's the director of our Princeton Journalism program, whose class, I believe, is tuning in right now. Indeed, a round of applause. And the work by folks like Joe and others around the country to inspire and inform the next generation of journalists that can follow in the footsteps of people like Michael. There's a whole other panel that we'll do at some point that mines the intersection of, Keith, I wanted to talk about speaking freely, which you've written about. I wanted to go into misinformation and disinformation and social media that Michael just talked about. That'll be another conversation topic. We're going to have one question round robin again as an out for us before Brent Colburn takes us home. So that question, and we'll go roughly in the order from before. What is the most heartening, hopeful thing for you in this moment? Keeanga, can I turn to you?
Sure. I mean, for me, the most encouraging thing throughout the Trump administration has been the willingness of people to engage in political protest and demonstrations and struggle for the world that most of us actually want. From the Women's March on the day before his inauguration in 2017 to the mobilization of people in protest at airports, to his Muslim ban, to the Parkland High School students, and certainly to the uprisings against racism and police brutality over the summer. And so I think that whether Biden wins, whether Trump wins, I think that same spirit and determination of mobilization will be just as critical. Because neither party, to be perfectly honest, has offered a substantive response to the depths of crisis represented by the pandemic. So millions of people face eviction, millions of people face homelessness, millions of people in this country are hungry, millions of people are unemployed. And I think that the example from the summer is that protest gets the goods. And that has been a defining feature, a through line throughout this administration. And that's what I'm hopeful. I don't believe that will end no matter who wins the election ultimately.
Thank you for that. I'm going to put in a plug for the work of Matthew Desmond and his team at Princeton in the Eviction Lab, touching on one of the important points you raised, Keeanga. Keith, to you, on a heartening, hopeful point.
You have to scratch your head a little bit. After the 2016 election, I had some hopeful narratives about what might emerge, and mostly they didn't emerge. So I do think it's encouraging that some very important issues have been put on the table. In some ways, I do remain hopeful that we might be able to find some common ground to actually tackle some of those issues moving forward. And I do take some immediate comfort in the fact that some of the senior leadership in the Republican Party seems to be backing off some of the more extreme aspects of Trumpism. Trumpism isn't going away after this election cycle, clearly. But on the other hand, I think some Republicans are trying to think seriously about how do you take on board some of the important aspects of that while shedding some of the less attractive, and that'd be best, all things considered.
Brandice. may I turn to you? Heartening and hopeful.
So yes, I mean, I find it really heartening that the U.S. political system, in the middle of this massive pandemic, has adjusted and is expanded, in different ways in different states, early voting and mail-in voting, and that the voters have responded. While I've acknowledged I'm a little not there yet to be convinced we'll have turnout as a percentage of eligible voters as high as since 1908, I think we're going to have an impressive showing. And it's just very heartening to see both the parties react by trying to make voting accessible, and the vote and the populists react by engaging with such vigor on this important election.
As Keeanga said. Mm-hmm. Ali, heartening and hopeful.
Yeah, so I don't think I have to reach too deep here, but I like Keeanga. I think the activism that we're seeing today is a big part of what gives me hope. And maybe just a little bit more specifically, the activism of young people, right? Like when I talk to my students, when I hear their questions in class, I just can't help but feeling hopeful about the future. And when I see these maps, right? If all 18 to 25-year-olds had voted, for example, and you see this wave of blue, I just can't help but feel heartened. And the through line for me in my comments in this has been about race, so I can't help but go back there. And I'm not the first political scientist to suggest this, but Trump has actually done some good on this issue in the sense of making it really, really clear to millions and millions of Americans that racism is alive in this country, that it's still a scourge that needs to be addressed, that will continue to plague our politics. And so, going back to the young people, right? I think it was easy for young people before Trump to think, well, it's not really a big problem. It's not something that is explicit and open in our politics today. And I think Trump has made it very clear that that's no longer the case. And young people, they're listening. And I know you are, and I thank you for it.
And I appreciate you looking straight into the camera when you said that. I also, in my 2 cents on a personal note, will recall utterances of the Chinese virus, but we'll put that aside for a second.
Absolutely. That's a part of the narrative that I'm trying to bring out.
Michael, heartening and hopeful.
What's heartening and hopeful, just jumping off, is that we did have a massive turnout for this election, and people, even in the face of a lot of voter suppression tactics coming from the Republicans, people found ways to vote. They came up with plans to vote, whether it was safest for them to do so by mail, or whether they reconciled that they may have to wait 5 or 6 hours in line, but they did it and they voted. And then also that the president of the United States from the White House can go on TV and say that he wants the Supreme Court to stop the counting of votes, and that actually didn't stop the counting of votes. In Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, people in the wee hours last night were still counting ballots because there are still some checks and balances for all the thrashing of norms that we've seen and Trump's continued attacks on democratic institutions and the press. That we can still be counting the votes. And while we were on this call, I believe CNN might have called Michigan, and the process is still continuing. Now there will be legal fights and no one is out of the woods yet, but it's good to see at least the process has been continuing in the last few hours.
My iMessage confirms that he has won Michigan.
Okay, yeah, I thought that popped up while we were talking.
Look at that. Folks who tuned in didn't realize they would also get breaking news. So not that anyone asked me, but the question on my mind, Michael, to build off what you said, is what is the durability of our institutions, of our democratic institutions? Full stop, new paragraph, unsung heroes, many of which you just touched on. I also want to give a shout to the Princeton students who took on amazing effort, Michael, along the lines you just talked about with the Vote 100 project and the Poll Heroes project. So thank you for that. Ali, to your point, what more can be done? What are the next steps? Continuing work like that. On that note, we are going to thank our panelists once again. We're also now going to turn to Brent Colburn, my friend and colleague, the Vice President for Public Affairs and Communications, to give us a brief perspective from the many a campaign trail he has been on. So Brent, I don't know if you can hear me, you're on mute. So consider that your vocal warm-up and start over.
That's great. I probably just lost audience share. Look, what I was just saying was that personally, it's such a pleasure and a privilege to get to listen to that amazing group of academics and journalists. I hope everyone who is tuning in realizes what a treat it is to have access to some of the best minds on these topics. And look, I come at this from a different perspective. I worked on campaigns for most of the last 2 decades, including 4 presidential campaigns on the Democratic side of the aisle. And I really look at this and look at last night and look at what's still going on this week through the lens of, what is an operative thinking and what is a campaign staffer thinking? And you have to look at a campaign as a staffer through kind of 2 lenses when you're doing post-campaign analysis. You have to look at kind of what changed and what was different and what was the same, right? And clearly there were 3 big buckets of different this time going in that were getting a lot of attention. So you had Donald Trump, he's a different kind of candidate, he's a different kind of president. You had the pandemic, clearly unprecedented during an election in our lifetimes to have such a disruptive national event. And you had this very public conversation about racism and police brutality that was going on in the summer and continues to go on in our nation. And those 3 things got a lot of attention. But what struck me coming out of last night is how little that changed what was actually going on that electoral map. So my first campaign was for Al Gore in 2000. I remember heading into Election Day, a very smart senior staffer telling me that if we won two of three states, we would win the presidency. Those states were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. You could have had the same line last night, right? We continue to look at the same map that we've been looking at for basically 2 decades. So at the electoral level, we're still kind of having the same conversation that we were having 20 years ago. Another thing that did not change is at the national level, as Ali, I think, indicated, we continue to basically be a center-right country, right? So for the 7th of 8 times, it looks like a Democrat will have won the popular vote. Unfortunately, the game is not the popular vote. The game is those 12 electoral states. And the record for Democrats at the electoral level continues to be kind of 4 wins out of those 8, 3 losses, and 1 to be determined, even though it's looking good for Joe Biden. And so you look at that, you say, okay, that hasn't changed, and you have to start asking yourself, what do we do to actually change that dynamic? And I think personally that both parties have been too focused on turnout elections and turning out their people in the last 20 years. We continue to have parties on both sides that go into these national elections with our people show up. And that's why we have this kind of gridlock within the Electoral College in these states that don't move. I mean, we're not only talking about the same states we were talking about 20 years ago, we're talking about the same counties that we were talking about 20 years ago. So look, I think one party or the other is going to have to take a chance here at some point if we're going to break this logjam and figure out how to go get new voters and figure out how to appeal to new parts of a new coalition. And I think Keith and Keeanga and others were indicating, both parties are going to kind of have this soul searching moment coming out of this campaign. It's funny, as a campaign staffer, when you lose a campaign at the presidential level, that journalists are going to go out and write these very thoughtful pieces about how your party is in the wilderness years. I think both parties are kind of in the wilderness years right now and need to go out and figure out exactly what they stand for and figure out how to go out and get new voters. And so just to wrap up with kind of 3 questions, the question I'm asking myself today, if I'm a smart Democratic staffer, is I'm asking, did Republicans turn out because of or in spite of Donald Trump? Understanding that will help you understand what issues you may be able to start talking about or start looking at to peel off some of those Republican voters and keep them in your camp for the long term. As Keeanga indicated, if I'm a Republican staffer, I'm thinking, what do these slight inroads with underrepresented minority communities mean? And can we exploit those in a way through our platform or through our politics to try to get more of those voters to consider coming across to our side? And then finally, at a very kind of meta level, the question that I just continue to wrestle with is, as a country where we continue to move center left and consistently vote at the national level center left, when do we hit a wall of legitimacy questions with a system through the Electoral College and the Senate that concentrates power away from where that center of the country is? And I think that's a big conversation that hopefully some people at places like Princeton will be engaged in over the coming years, because it's a pretty fundamental question to who we are as a country and where we go from here. So Ben, with that, I'll shut up. I know that was a lot of rambling, but there's a lot to talk about, and hand it back over to you.
Oh, that was edifying ramble, if it was rambling, and I was taking quick notes. I want to give an immense thanks again to all of our speakers today and to all of you for tuning in. I hope that indeed you stay engaged, whether at Princeton or beyond. Thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you sometime soon, virtually or in person.